Tradable permits are an area that is actually mentioned on the specification, so this is taken directly from the specification, but it's not been asked as a direct question before, so just be a bit cautious of that, because they do have an obligation to ask a question on every part of the specification. So here's your definition of tradable permits. A permit that allows the owner to emit a certain amount of pollution. So that first part of your definition is makes tradable permits sound very much like regulation, and they are in some ways. The diagram that we're going to draw for this does seem very like a regulation diagram. But it's a little bit more complex than just straightforward regulation. And that, if unused or only partially used, can be sold to another polluter. So if you only partially use your permits, you could sell them on and therefore receive some revenue from selling this on. So in that way, it's a little bit like a subsidy. But to polluters that are polluting above the certain amount that you've set, they have to purchase additional permits, and so to them it's a little bit like an indirect tax on their production. So a tradable permit is just really a regulation mixed in with some of the elements of what a subsidy is and some of the elements of what an indirect tax is. So this is a diagram. It's not the best diagram in the world, but this is a diagram that they give you in the book, so that we'll go along with it. So we can see that supply is perfectly inelastic, and that is representing the set amounts of pollution, the limit or the cap that it's sometimes called. And we can see even if demand increases or reduces, the equilibrium quantity is still set at that amount. It just puts, for example, if demand increases, it puts upwards pressure on the price level of a pollution permit. So there's a nice video here about how pollution permits work, or tradable permits, and that video is mainly about the European Union ETS, the emission trading scheme, and you can understand how it works and have a look at some of the problems of that scheme. It is worth a watch. So what are the benefits of using tradable permits? Well, it uses the market mechanism. It's using the forces of demand and supply, and it's providing incentives for people not only to reduce the amount of pollution that they create as firms, but also to invest in cleaner technology, because there's this incentive, there's a reward to reduce your pollution down to below what the limit sets it out, the cap sets it out. It also uses the polluter pays principle, because you are basically imposing an indirect tax on any polluter that pollutes above the set limit, and therefore you are internalising the external costs, so these negative externalities that could occur. However, there are some disadvantages. So theoretically, you could apply tradable permits to anything that produces external costs, or could be, thought of as a demerit good. However, it's only really realistic for large-scale negative externalities. So when we look at the EU ETS, it's not applied to absolutely every firm in the EU that produces CO2 emissions. It's only applied to firms above a certain size or producing above a certain amount of CO2 emissions. And the reason is, if you were going to apply this to every firm in the EU, it'd be very cumbersome, it'd be very complicated, it'd be very hard to coordinate, it'd be very hard to police. And therefore, the costs of doing that would far outweigh any benefits that you're getting from it. So the huge opportunity cost of what you're spending the money on. So when we think about tradable permits, we really think about CO2 emissions or other types of emissions as well. We're not particularly thinking of this as a realistic measure for reducing, say, smoking, because how would you police that? And it'd be really, really complicated, just really cumbersome. Could you imagine how easy it would be you'd be able to get away with kind of smoking more than your permits allow you to. Another negative for tradable permits is that it doesn't raise revenue for the government like an indirect tax would. So when firms that are polluting above the cap have to purchase additional permits, the revenue from these additional permits is not going directly to the government. The revenue is going to the companies, the firms that sold those permits, so they would be the cleaner producers. Also, your third negative, and this is it's not so much a negative, it's not something too difficult to get right, but this is, you know, one of those factors that you could say the effectiveness of a tradable permit depends upon the cap or the limit being set low enough to enable the price of a permit to be high enough to give an incentive for firms to invest in cleaner technology and reduce the amount of pollution that they create. So if I just go back, I can explain that if we just go back to the diagram. So if the cap or the limit is not set low enough, so it's somewhere out here, you can see that the further supply is to the right hand side, the lower the price of a permit is going to be. Okay, so say a permit is something like 50p per tonne or 25p per tonne. I think in the video it does mention it being that low. And say, you know, kind of investing in cleaner technology would cost £1.50 a tonne per year. The equivalent of that, you know, what is the business going to do? Well, they're just going to purchase more permits because that's the cheaper option. However, if the government set the cap low enough, so they're setting this limit further towards the origin, so further towards the left, this pushes the price upwards, and therefore we could say a permit then becomes kind of £3 to purchase. Well, what's cheaper, £1.50 a year or £3? Well, it's going to be the £1.50. So there's more of an incentive to invest in cleaner technology. But unless you actually have this cap set low enough, you don't provide an incentive to invest in the cleaner technology. And that's been one of the problems of the EU ETS, and it mentions that in the video as well. So alternatives, of course, you can always have indirect tax, so this raises revenue for the government, but unfortunately it doesn't reward cleaner producers. You could as well, another alternative that I haven't written on this page, you could have subsidies for investment in cleaner technology, but of course that would be the government's money, so it would be expensive for the government, whereas this kind of keeps all the money flowing within the system. So dirtier producers are funding the cleaner producers and their investment in the technology. Another alternative would be regulation, and with regulation you could more easily include every business, but you would have to police it, just like tradable permit schemes. You'd have to have people that regulate it and go around, but it'd be a little bit easier than tradable permits to coordinate and to set up, because you wouldn't have to have this marketplace for the permits to be traded. Okay, so there's never been an essay question on this area before, but this is an old question from a legacy paper that I found. So it does mention tradable pollution permits. So this is something that you could look at, and the essay question would probably be along these lines. So explaining how it works and any benefits, explaining the negatives, and explaining what those benefits would depend upon or any alternatives.